Do you know how it feels when you love a game that's overshadowed by its much more popular sister game? Grand Theft Auto was such a big part of gaming during the mid-2000s, and it had 5 main titles that were basically all part of the GTA PS2 saga. Even if everyone, including Rockstar themselves, act like it's only a trilogy because they don't want my PSP loving heart to be happy. The series peaked in 2004, and while working towards the next generation entry, we got a couple of PSP side entries that existed mostly to keep money pouring in when the series was riding success after success. They could be viewed as cash grabs, and while I don't doubt that was the intention, these two titles both did a lot for the series and justified the PSP to many a 12-year-old. Liberty City Stories was technologically impressive and a fun first attempt at putting these games on the PSP, but it was still quite inconsistent and it never quite reached the heights it should have. A year later we saw a second attempt, which marked the last game in the series based off GTA 3. This too was a prequel using an existing city and showing earlier points in established characters' lives, including a protagonist who had a small role in the game it's borrowing most from. Set in 1984, Vice City, we play as Vic Vance, the brother of the Lance Dance creator Lance Vance. He's a no-nonsense guy who just wants to do what he can to support his siblings and mum who are all struggling. To meet this goal, he enlists in the military, but this stint doesn't last too long and it's effectively just our tutorial and prologue setting the stage. His commanding officer basically forces him to do a series of very illegal tasks, and he's kicked out for this when others just see Vic holding the bag. Vic isn't initially here to be a master criminal sitting highly in a gang, and this does set him apart from the other GTA protagonists of the era. He's almost a precursor to Niko Bellic, and much like him, he's dragged into deeper problems with a scheming family member. I do wonder if there was some internal homework copying between these games, or if it's just a coincidence, or it could even be a sign of the times as we were approaching the gritty era of games. Despite that, and the fact that Vic himself would be able to fit in with all the serious and tragic protagonists of the brown and grey period, the world itself rarely takes itself seriously, and it's one that blends in wonderfully with the PS2 contemporaries. Vic is the straight man to an exaggerated and colourful world that knows what it is, a sandbox for teenagers with parents who don't care. The game isn't afraid to be serious, but this Miami Vice-inspired world is full of explosions and high-octane antics, and it doesn't slow the game down to dwell on various dates or night out with the boys to the pub where we keep playing Dance Until I Win. That said, Vic is still the tragic straight man here, and we get to experience this rollercoaster with someone who actually has motives and goals. He's surprisingly relatable for a mass-murdering crime lord, although the cynic in me would say there is a disconnect between his personality and in-game actions, but unlike someone like Niko Bellic, this game isn't afraid to call him out on his hypocrisy, and it doesn't bother to go down the route of saying he's ultimately a great person that can still be redeemed even if he has a 9-to-5 job killing people. In a vacuum, Vic would be a great person. He's loyal, he's dependable, caring, and he has magic gloves that only exist in cutscenes. He could be seen as selfless considering the whole story is about him making money for his family, but I'm seeing the money he's making and there's no way the majority is going anywhere else. He's definitely hoarding his wealth, but even if his ideals and motives are all the best, his actions aren't, and he does a lot of reprehensible stuff. The game is a tale of corruption, and it's ultimately a tragedy when paired with the original Vice City, where we see a lot of these characters, including this game's protagonist, die only 2 years later. But while we're on the wild ride of Vic Vance's empire, we get a rise unlike anything else in the series. Vic starts at the absolute bottom, taking orders from racist pieces of work who are more than happy to commit domestic violence, all the way to leading an empire of smuggling, robbery, and other not great activities thanks to all the real estate he's buying and passive income that keeps rolling in. The beginning of this game honestly could be quite triggering to some people, and I was worried the tone would continue down this line, but it does change its course almost immediately after its opening missions. GTA as a series is one that crosses multiple boundaries, and people are free not to enjoy that. I know I have my issues at times, but usually it's done for humour, but at the early game here it's a lot more dramatic. It seriously makes me hate some of these characters, which I'm sure was the goal, but it could easily hit some nerves for people. The beginning of the game is not feel-good fun. As discredited ex-military, Vic has no one and truly starts from the bottom. It's genuinely unpleasant, and I'm glad everyone involved is dealt with quickly. Vic starts the game with an antagonist set up immediately, and from the beginning we all know how this will end. But we're so far away from doing this with very small scale and doing things like protection rackets and helping a moonshine bootlegger. Things escalate progressively, but without ever feeling too sudden. One thing leads to another, which leads to another, and so on until we're at the very top. We start a small gang just to keep ourselves safe while we have a target on our back, and we take possession of a property whose owner isn't able to manage it due to a case of death. Things keep expanding slowly, but surely, and there wouldn't be any problems with it, except things escalate way too quickly once Lance Vance gets in. Lance constantly makes things harder for everyone around him, but he is also the reason the game is so fun and not so depressing. Thanks to him forcing us into these very bad situations, we get an action-packed game that keeps escalating to the point we end with a military attack helicopter shooting people inside a skyscraper. This game feels like the end of an era for GTA. The series grounded itself much more after this game, but this one does still ground itself just a little more as well. This is chaotic enough to feel like the older titles, but it is also a necessary stepping stone to the HD series. Gameplay-wise, we see a lot of really smart additions which make Vice City Stories feel truly ahead of GTA games of the era. Even if in a more general sense it does feel like a step back from San Andreas, it's surprisingly not as big a step as you'd expect. Liberty City Stories was a half step between 3 and Vice City, but Vice City Stories feels like a half step between Vice City and San Andreas, but also one that decidedly took a sharp turn to do its own thing instead of just poorly emulating San Andreas. We still don't have things like crouch shooting because of the PSP limitations, and of course there is no right stick on this original release. We have short loading screens between islands, and radio stations are still just looping tracks here. The PSP isn't a miracle worker, and of course this will be much weaker than the earlier console titles. But despite that, a lot of other additions were included to help this game feel more refined than Vice City. For instance, there is swimming here, and while it's not as refined as San Andreas or the titles that came after, this is still a huge leap over Vice City. We have a stamina meter that kills us if depleted while we're swimming, but hey, it's better than just dying immediately. If you fall in the water or your boat blows up, you have a few moments to get back to safety. This alone makes the beaches of Vice City much more welcoming. Boating always made me feel anxious in the other titles since one wrong move and you're basically dead. But here, I feel free when I fail miserably, and not just because of the swimming, but because of what I feel this game's defining feature is, its generosity. Contrary to what my parents think, I don't have unlimited free time. I value my time on this mortal plane. I say this as I record a video on why a 15-year-old game in one of the most mainstream gaming series ever is actually underrated. When I die in other GTA games of the era, I'm not above reloading a save game to retain my weapons and money. This was especially true in my recent revisit to Liberty City Stories, which could be brutally difficult. There was almost never a time in that game that I took my death legitimately. Vice City Stories gives you a slap on the wrist whenever you lose all your health or are busted. You basically get to pay a measly $2,000 to retain all your weapons and ammo. Honestly, it's too generous, and while I feel like a sliding scale based on either the amount of stuff I'm getting back or the total money available in my account would be better, this is still head and shoulders above the older systems. This feature is a godsend, and it did prevent me from save scumming between missions, which dramatically kept the game's pace up. On top of that, whenever we fail a mission and respawn, a taxi will be there waiting to take us right back. This was also a feature on Liberty City Stories, but that'd be asking you to return completely empty-handed, which you may as well not have done. We also get a prompt to skip the initial drive whenever we redo a mission. Most missions ask you to drive from the starting location to wherever the action is. This is now a one-time drive, even if you've started the mission numerous times. Each of these on their own would not necessarily make the game better, as Liberty City Stories showed us, but cumulatively, we get a game that doesn't want you to waste time on preamble, and is happy for you to fail, but not in a sadistic way. When the game gets more difficult, I'm never annoyed because I'm basically using all these features to skip all the tedium. Another area Vice City Stories outshines most of the games of the era in is the amount and variety of vehicles. In addition to cars, boats, and motorcycles from the last handheld entry, we also have the return of helicopters from Vice City, quad bikes, bicycles, and aeroplanes from San Andreas, albeit the last one is limited to 2 propeller-based planes instead of jets, But we also have the introduction of jet skis, which are basically water motorcycles complete with falling off whenever you hit a single thing. We also have a hovercraft here, which is a wonderful inclusion because it makes me remember Diddy Kong Racing. This is a wonderful selection of vehicles. Oh yeah, and there's also forklifts. It's not a GTA game without them. This helps to add a lot of variety to both our wasting time in the sandbox, but also our missions. And it doesn't just stop there thanks to the fact we have more mission set pieces and unique interiors to work with. The lack of an option to replay missions is much more missed here than it was in the previous title, as a lot more care and creativity was poured into each one of these. Whether it's because we play as a domesticbot inside a rich guy's home, or protect Phil Collins from above his own concert, or do something as low-key as being at a fast food joint but it's being robbed now. Care was put into each of these places you only see once for a few minutes across the entire game, and it helps make each mission stand out. Not every single mission is using unique interior locations. It's still Grand Theft Auto, and the game is full of Grand Theft Auto. But the mission design and variety of vehicles helps keep it above a lot of the earlier titles. These are some really enjoyable missions, and they're presented by an eclectic range of characters who are all memorable in their own way, even if it's in bad ways, like Rockstar's constant use of fat phobia as a punchline. The game has perhaps the best romance in the GTA franchise, which isn't exactly a high bar. They're only good because the rest of them are much worse. But the one here in Vice City Stories is well integrated and believable, and it doesn't suffer from out-of-place dating missions unless a quad bike race counts. We also have a strong contender for best villain in the GTA franchise. Martinez is not only one of the worst people imaginable, he kickstarts the whole story and is a lingering threat throughout. He doesn't just disappear for large sections of the game, he always feels like he's one step ahead of you until he isn't. Sandwiched between his beginning and end, we also get a varied cast that includes characters like Diaz and Phil Cassidy from Vice City, some guy called Phil Collins, and also exciting new characters like the slightly problematic but endearing and lovable Rennie. Rennie was a sticking point I was worried about heading into this game. I remembered their running gag of having multiple surgeries to better match their gender, and they kept switching back and forth to the point that we see them after they've already had bottom surgery 3 times, and in the mission So Long Schlong they get bottom surgery number 4. To be a bit more serious, this stuff can be legitimately harmful, and it definitely lived rent-free in my head as a problematic portrayal for years. The stereotypes are all there, and I won't be surprised if many people can't stomach this tone-deaf character, but I did still love them. They were very eccentric and fun to watch, and they stole all their cutscenes. There was also a lot less direct antagonism at their identity here than I expected. I wouldn't call this good representation, and it's very 2006, but like watching a campy gay character in earlier media, you can still enjoy them even if you know the intentions weren't the best. And since we went from this to haha isn't it funny and random Trevor wore a dress in GTA 5, I still think this is some of Rockstar's best representation. Outside of story missions, the game will push you to build your various empires, which is tedious, especially early on when they're all so fragile, but the reward is more money that you can spend on more places to save the game, so they are worth the hassle. This overflow of income and the fact that you're barely punished for dying does turn this into a more action-packed and frantic GTA title. After the first few hours, you'll have no money issues, and thanks to the arsenal of weapons here, you'll go all out with the more ludicrously expensive weapons like miniguns without worrying that you're wasting your money on ammo. It could be argued this breaks the difficulty, but I feel like the game was designed around this, and I also don't mind any extra assistance that I can get because the PSP isn't a friendlier system when it comes to camera control. I'm just evening the balance a little. Plus, GTA games always felt like power fantasies anyway, and this game demonstrates it better than most. The map of Vice City is just as much of a mixed bag as it was in the original game. We have some great areas here, but thanks to the landmasses just being long rectangles, they're much taller than they are wide. This leads to a lot of repetitious driving north and south, while going any other direction for more than a moment will have you drive directly into the water. I never liked the actual landmasses here, but every area is at least memorable, and it lends itself to the game that expects you to memorize locations, or just follow vague directions. It might seem too small at a first glance, but it manages to be varied, and excluding the giant beach and golf course hogging the map, every area is used wonderfully and sticks out. It's good that the map isn't needed because it's littered with icons for our empires anyway. Despite all that, the game actually made the map of Vice City make sense to me. It feels like a tease to have a giant beach with so much water in a game where it's an instant kill. Grand Theft Auto Vice City Stories was a game I always held in high regard, but after replaying it for the first time in well over a decade, I have to admit this game is still as good as it ever was, some dated jokes notwithstanding. This is still one of the best entries in the series for its combination of great gameplay, story, variety, and additions which aid convenience. I would never say Vice City is a favourite location of mine, and if I were looking at this as just a sandbox, I'd have to rank it lower than the larger HD titles. But everything else in the game combines so well from beginning to end, this is still my second favourite GTA all things considered. Play this neglected title and appreciate Lance Vance's Lance Dance one more time.